Okay, so this morning, we left off this morning on the lecture talking about Britain and their involvement in China, and I left off talking about the First Opium War, where the one good that Britain found that China was willing to trade for was opium, a highly addictive drug that wreaked havoc on the Chinese population for a good long time. When the Chinese resisted the importation of this drug into their country, the British waged war against them to not only continue trading the drug into their country, but also to take over all of their major shipping ports. So from the time of the end of the Opium War all the way until I was in 7th grade, Hong Kong actually remained a possession of the British. That resulted in some interesting developments. Hong Kong, even to this day, has been troubled with their integration into the greater country of China, which is obviously communist and more or less a dictatorship. Hong Kong, on the other hand, was relatively westernized and so on. The major treaty provisions of the Treaty of Nanking outside of Hong Kong, though, is that Britain gained what's known as extraterritorial rights. Extraterritorial rights essentially means that as foreigners in port cities in China in this scenario, that Chinese law did not apply to British traders. And so British subjects would not be subject to the laws of China and thus would continue to trade illegal substances. Mind you, of course, opium and the trade of opium and sale of opium in Britain was either illegal or highly regulated. And as a result of that, we have to come to the conclusion that Britain knew that what they were doing was something that was harmful to the Chinese people. China never becomes a formal colony, though. It is never technically a colony because China still retains a government structure. It retains domestic sovereignty over its citizens. And so as a result of this, Britain is controlling Chinese trade, but not controlling Chinese government. And it goes on this way for some time, all the way up until the 20th century, really. And it wasn't only Britain. Britain just had a good number of ports that they took over, but the Germans got in on the action, the French got in on the action. And so China is sovereign in, at least in name and in its own governmental independence, but economically they're very much under the dominion of European influence. There was a second Opium War about 15 years later in 1856, which once again forced even more ports to be opened to the British and French indefinitely. And China was forced to accept trade and investment on unfavorable terms for the foreseeable future. So things were not going well for China. Ultimately, there's a rebellion known as the Taiping Rebellion of 1850. This was primarily caused by differing Chinese factions who began to disagree with the Qing dynasty's leniency of their treatment towards the British. It came to a situation where, although the Qing dynasty at first resented British involvement, there came a point where, once again, very similar to how a drug addict becomes in a toxic, dependent relationship to a drug dealer, the Chinese became involved in a rather toxic, dependent relationship on the British for economic viability, and ultimately turned a blind eye to a lot of the bad things that the British were doing. This caused resentment amongst the Chinese population. And the leader of the Taiping Rebellion was a guy named Hong Xiuquan, and he was actually a school teacher. But in this rebellion, as many as 20 million people died. And ultimately, the Manchus defeated the rebellion after 14 years of help with the British military, who ended up assisting in putting down the rebellion, because the last thing that the British want to see is a rebellion that ousts them, right? They want to retain their economic stranglehold over China, and so they don't want to see this rebellion prevail. Can you guys remind me to update the attendance before you leave? Thank you. So much of eastern China by the late 19th century became dominated by Britain, France, Russia, Japan, and Germany. There was the Sino-Japanese War of 1845 to 1895, which resulted in the Treaty of Shimonoseki, where the Japanese gained control over Taiwan and Liaodong Peninsula. The British gained a trade monopoly on the Yangtze River. The French gained a lease on Canton Bay. Russia controlled northern Manchuria, which they were trying to use to build the rest of the Trans-Siberian Railway to connect it to the Pacific. And Germany gained a 99-year lease on the port of Qingdao and concessions to build 2 railroad lines in the Shandong province. So as you can see, throughout the entire 19th century, China is coming increasingly under the influence, the sphere of influence of foreign powers. Oops, I don't know what I did here, but... Okay. The United States, fearing that China would be closed off to America by European powers, began advocating for what was known as the open door policy. On the surface, this is going to sound like it's a pro-Chinese policy. It is not. It is a pro-American policy. And what the U.S. open door policy basically stated was that no European power should colonialize or colonize China, because this is against the principles of free trade. And so they wanted to open commercial trading to imperial latecomers, such as itself. The United States was a latecomer to the game of imperialism, and the United States began urging the Europeans to allow free trade within China while respecting its territorial integrity. But once again, please understand, this policy was not necessarily sympathetic to the Chinese cause. It was more about protecting potential avenues of commerce for the United States in China, which has a massive population and a huge market. India. So the British East India Company retained direct control and was responsible to the Parliament after the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763. Remember that after the 7 Years' War, whatever French possessions they had in India went over to the British. And a British guy by the name of Robert Clive captured military posts in Madras, and England ousted France from India completely, essentially. There was a mutiny called the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857-58, and what this was, if you know anything about the population of India, it is divided on 2 major fronts. The first is that some of the population is Hindu and some of the population is Muslim. And these religious differences were already problematic prior to the British coming there, but remained and still remain problematic even to modern day. The other thing being that in the 1800s in particular, the caste system strictly divided the Indian population into many different groups. And So, taking all of this into consideration, in case you're wondering, like, how come the Indian population didn't just unite and oust the British? There were divisions in place that prevented them from being able to effectively do this. But there was a mutiny. In the British East India Company, many, many Indian peoples worked. And there was a rumor that started spreading around that the cartridges used for ammunition in guns were lubricated using either pork or beef fat. And this was upsetting to the population of India. Number one, the Muslim population of India, Muslims don't eat pork, and so it's seen as unclean, so it would upset them. Cows are sacred in Hindu culture, and so using cow lard was upsetting to them. It essentially angers everyone, regardless of their background. And there was an insurrection of both Hindu and Muslim soldiers in the British East India Company military, which spread in northern and central India before it ultimately was crushed, primarily by loyal native troops from southern India who benefited more from their ties to the British East India Company. And it was ultimately caused by changes administered in the British East India Company, such as the outlawing of sati, the caste system, and using sacred and impure animal fat on sepoy gun cartridges. After 1858, India becomes ruled by British Parliament in London and administered by a tiny all-white civil service in India. So after the Sepoy Mutiny, this period of time in Indian history is often referred to as the Raj, A-R-A-J, where India comes under direct control from the British government in London, and no longer in the control of the British East India Company. So British reforms in India. There was a modern system of progressive secondary education to train Indian civil servants in India. There were a number of economic reforms like irrigation systems, railroads, tea and jute plantations, and this ultimately, resulted in the creation of a unified and powerful state in India. Sometimes India was nicknamed the jewel in the crown, meaning like the centerpiece, most important jewel of the British Empire. The Indian National Congress was formed in 1885. Predominantly educated Hindu Indians began demanding increased equality and self-government, home rule as it's sometimes called in India. However, it would be some time before India became independent and sovereign, and that doesn't happen until just after World War II in 1946. Here you can see the members of the First Indian National Congress of 1885. There were other British colonies in Southeast Asia, such as Burma, which is now modern-day Thailand. Well, actually, not Thailand, I'm sorry. It's modern-day, what would that be? I guess Burma. Thailand was a little bit further east, although part of Thailand was in Burma. Anyway, Borneo, the Malay Peninsula, and so on. Here's a famous political cartoon published around the time of the new imperial age of the late 1800s, and you can see a stereotypical looking British guy there with his top hat on in England like an octopus with a bunch of hands all over the globe administering them. French colonies. You had Indochina, which include Laos and Cambodia, as well as Vietnam, and they also had Tahiti and New Caledonia. And you had some German territories in the Marshall Islands and Samoa. And then after the Spanish-American War, the United States took the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, and bases in Cuba. So, responses to Western imperialism in Asia, in particular in China. In 1900, there was a patriotic national uprising by what became known as the Boxer Rebellion, but if you really translated it, it would translate to something like the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, but that's kind of a mouthful to say, so they just reduced it to Boxer Rebellion. But patriotic uprising by Chinese nationalists against Western encroachment and extraterritorial control over their ports. It ends up being put down by the Qing dynasty in 1900, and this dynasty soon fell afterwards. Dr. Sun Yat-sen was a nationalist. He founded what became known as the Kuomintang, which I know I'm saying wrong, but I don't speak Chinese, so forgive me. But he was a revolutionary, and he sought to overthrow the Manchu, aka Qing dynasty, and establish a republic. This sparked the beginning of really what became the first cohesive nationalist movement in China. By a political party, the Kuomintang, and there were three principles of the people that Dr. Sun Yat-sen believed in. Number one, nationalism, particularly, of course, pride in the Chinese nation, democracy, and the people's livelihood. In Japan, winding the clock back to 1853, the Japanese had been largely completely isolated in the Pacific Ocean. They had very, very little contact with anyone outside of the island of Japan. In 1853, American naval officer by the name of Commodore Matthew Perry rolled up with a U.S. steamship to Tokyo Bay, and the Japanese had never seen anything like it before. In 1853, they immediately feared the potential of Western takeover, which was already underway in China, and Matthew Perry essentially forces Japan to open up to the notion of trade. The United States wasn't going and trying to necessarily take all of Japan over at first, although they would have been happy, I think, to establish a foothold there. But they signed what became known as the Treaty of Kanagawa, which opened several ports to American trade. Shortly thereafter, emperor, a new, young, reform, modernizing-minded emperor by the name of the Meiji Emperor, as he's sometimes referred to, instituted a number of political reforms in Japan that included a strong centralized government. Prior to the arrival of the Americans in Japan, there had been essentially a military dictatorship in charge with a guy known as the Tokugawa shogun, who basically ran the military and the government. And the Tokugawa shogun was removed from power. The emperor took control, and he had a very Bismarckian model in terms of his rule. He basically made most of the authority within the Japanese government rest within the executive branch. The upper house of the Meiji would be the Meiji oligarchy, which were a bunch of wealthy, landed Japanese folks, and an imperial diet, which would be chosen through election. The result was a system that was somewhat democratic in form, but rather despotic in practice. It was very oligarchical. You had these large, land-owning, wealthy Japanese folks who were investing a whole lot of money into completely revolutionizing the entire system. They created all sorts of new things. They modeled their education system after the American education system. They modeled their army after the German army. They modeled their navy after the British navy. Essentially what Japan tries to do in the latter half of the 1800s is to, within about 45 years, completely rapidly modernize and industrialize their entire country to be competitor with European imperial powers. And they are successful in doing so. The major priority, as I mentioned, was all economic. They developed a business class that adopted Western methods. They introduced a new banking system. They built and improved their railroads and ports. They organized an entire telegraph system for long-distance immediate communication. And industries began to grow. They began modernizing their military, making new weaponry, investing in engineering, shipbuilding, and so on. Once a business or enterprise was on its feet, it was turned over to private ownership. You had these families that were business oligarchical families known as zaibatsu, and industry was booming during this time. All the problems that industrialization brings, Japan was not immune from. They had to resolve a number of these kinds of issues, including urbanization, overpopulation, food shortages. Japan in particular is not quite as bountiful in resources as a place like Britain was, so they relied heavily on external trade, importing things from other places. That too was an obstacle, but they did manage to get over. Social changes. They ended legal distinctions between classes. They had kind of their own sort of caste system in Japan. They completely reformed their military, embarking on a major program to create a military force that would compete with all the other major powers in the modern world. They built a number of schools and universities. They supported universal education, including in technical subjects, and adopted the American model of education. Western culture began to flourish there. They started embracing Western fashion, Western sports. And some women were eventually allowed to receive an education. There were a lot of, and remain to be a lot of, gender peculiarities, we'll say, in Japan. And from 1894 to 1912, women represented about 60% of the Japanese labor force. And by 1898, women were forbidden to participate in government and legally I don't know what that means, legally put together with minors, but forbid to participate in government. The Russo-Japanese War I mentioned before, the first major time that European powers had seen the potential of Japan was in the Russo-Japanese War, in this engagement where the Russians fought against the Japanese over control of southern Manchuria, where the Russians were trying to build the Trans-Siberian Railway across Manchuria. And the Japanese fleet completely destroyed the Russian fleet off of the coast of Korea. They won a number of major battles on land, but the Russians eventually turned the tide on the land, but it wasn't enough. And the Westerners that witnessed the outcome of the Russo-Japanese War were pretty horrified to see that an Asian nation had so rapidly caught up to the level of industrialization and military prowess that Russia and perhaps other European nations had. The end of the Russo-Japanese War was mediated by the United States, by Teddy Roosevelt, who was the president at the time. And this ended the war with Japan winning major concessions from Russia, and this was their preferred position as well. In Manchuria, they made Korea a protectorate, which they had already largely gained control over in the late 1800s, and half of the Sakhalin Island. The long-term impact of the Russo-Japanese War is that Russia turned their focus away once again from the Pacific back over to the Balkans, and eventually this results in the Russian Revolution and the revolt of Asia in the 20th century. Many Asian nations hoped to emulate Japanese power and win their independence. Okay, the Ottoman Empire. Okay, the Ottoman Empire. As you know, the Ottoman Empire has been labeled in this class already the sick man of Europe. It is a dying empire. And there were a number of provincial rulers that increased in power, but they had a number of economic problems and widespread corruption. Also, you had all of the nationalist revolts happening in the areas that the Ottoman Empire controlled, such as the Balkans, as well as Greeks, Serbs, and Bulgarians. Europeans sought to benefit from the collapse of the Roman Empire. In particular, Austria and Russia were always clamoring to get as many lands away from the Ottomans as they could. The Ottomans do try, as kind of a stopgap measure, to reform things. They tried to improve their education system. They had Europeans come over to train their militaries. They even sent young men to the West to try to study new sciences and technologies to be able to incorporate into their economy. But the question was, what else are they going to learn in Western Europe? And ultimately, these kinds of things that they learned led to an increase in the population. How is this going to be a problem? Well, the various rulers of the Ottoman Empire rejected one form of modernization or westernization that was needed to compete with the rest of the European nations and to complete the puzzle, and that was the reform of their governmental system. So they basically tried to completely reinstate the autocracy that was there, an absolutist form of government. As we will see in Russia, this fails. You cannot run a government in the late early 1900s that is considered modern and westernized and still be using absolutism to try to run it. It's just not going to work. And that's exactly what they do, and it fails. And so ultimately, there are a lot of people who really reject the idea of absolutism in the Ottoman Empire. In the 1890s, a young group known as the Young Turks was a liberal group that stated that reform to the government was the only way to save the Ottoman Empire. And in 1908, the Young Turks overthrew the Sultan. And before the reforms that the Young Turks had intended to make under the leadership of a guy by the name of Mustafa Kemal, Kemal, the First World War broke out. So there wasn't enough racetrack left. It was too late. The First World War, began just 6 years after the autocratic government was overthrown, but 6 years wasn't enough time to turn the tide in the Ottoman Empire. And by the end of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire would be completely dissolved altogether. There's also other things happening in the Middle East. None of the nations of the Middle East really have true sovereignty at this time. Many of them had either been under the rule of the Ottoman Empire or more or less the influence of European nations. But for a time, Western Europe, I'll just start at the top. Western European nations such as Russia and Britain battled for influence in the region now known as Iran. For a time, each country set up a sphere of influence in the region, but in 1900, the discovery of oil led to increased tensions between Russia and Britain, but Britain was the one that eventually became dominant in the struggle when troops were sent in. Throughout World War I, the British are trying to continue to get a foothold in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, places like that where there were plenty of oil fields that would contribute to further advance in industrialization. Opponents to imperialism. Probably the best known opponent to imperialism would have to be Karl Marx. Karl Marx was extremely anti-imperial. He wrote Das Kapital in 1867, which was one of his other major works outside of the Communist Manifesto, claiming that the bourgeoisie needed constantly expanding markets to increase profit, and that this would invariably lead to the conquest of other peoples, indigenous peoples around the world. Markets are what keep capitalism growing, right? You need to continue selling your goods, and you need more people to sell those goods to. Another famous opponent to imperialism was J.A. Hobson, who was the most prominent of the anti-imperialist theorists. He stated that imperialist powers needed colonies in order to provide new markets for domestic European goods. He claimed that businessmen and bankers unduly influenced governments' imperialist policies, that it was actually large corporations that were influencing the government to make policies that would subdue and oppress people who lived in other places in the world. And he believed that if European governments forced businesses to raise wages for workers, this would result in increased consumption of goods and less of a need for new markets abroad. If you just brought people's individual earnings up at home, they would then be able to purchase more things, and you wouldn't need to worry so much about going and acquiring extremely cheap markets in other areas. Anti-imperialism increased in Europe as a result of Hobson's work and others, and socialists accepted Hobson's link of capitalism with imperialism, and Vladimir Lenin of Russia saw imperials as leading to colonial rivalries and invariably war. Some of the effects of imperialism: the emergence of anti-colonialism. This was the primary response to colonialism, was nationalism. For example, nationalist movements in China with Kuomintang and Sun Yat-sen. In India, you had the India Home Rule movement. Probably most famously associated with that would be Gandhi. And, the idea here is nationalism ends up being a foreign phenomenon that's imported to the West, but actually ultimately is used by these people in these areas that have been turned into colonies to battle against the West. So people in societies with naturally defined borders and subjects of a king were not used to this type of Western-style rule. So modern nationalism was a product of colonialism, not a reaction to it. Okay, advantages and disadvantages. Of course, mother country advantages include new markets, raw materials, the spread of their imperial influence, the development of distant military bases, as well as the spread of Western culture, faith, law, etc., government. Disadvantages, of course, would be things like disease, nationalistic uprisings against imperial rule. In terms of the imperialized territory, the colonies, there are some advantages. They get new medicines, they get new technology, they get new education systems, and they get things like railroads and stuff. But the disadvantages, of course, is that you have a complete loss of culture or identity, because these people become subjects of rulers from foreign influence and so on, and they become dependent in many cases on the colonial power that has taken them over. So this brings me to the end of the lecture for today. What I will have you guys do here, I actually have so many more assignments that I could be giving you guys that I have not because of the chaotic schedule. But this brings us to the end of at least the lecture portion of things. I'm thinking that we will have the test on Friday of this week for mass society, age of mass society and imperialism. And maybe on Wednesday we will be doing this activity relating to analyzing primary resources related to imperialism and stuff. So that'll probably be what we do on Wednesday. That'll be your assignment. I've already posted the new reading guide questions, which is 46 through 60. And so basically for the remainder of class, I'm just going to open it up for you guys to work on that. Yeah? The test will be in person, yes, on Friday. So it's going to be divided into two sections. You'll complete the first half of it in the morning, whether or not you're here, and then you'll complete the second half of it in the afternoon, whether or not you're here. Okay? Yep. Can you say it louder? Most likely. Most likely. Okay. Thanks so much for tuning in here online, folks, and we'll see you back on Wednesday.